What is your favorite smell? Not diapers, we know that. Coffee. Who likes coffee? God bless coffee, hey? Stuffing. Turkey. Steak on a barbecue. What's grass? Mowed grass. Fresh grass, fresh. We all have these favorite smells. My favorite smell is the trees in the forests and the mountains. Whenever we drive through the mountains, I am like this dog. I literally roll down the window and I'm like, and Sarah's like, watch where we're going. I'm like, it's okay, I can smell the way. I absolutely adore. And I hope where I retire, I can walk out the door and smell trees. I absolutely love it. And it's fascinating how smells can just absolutely change the atmosphere, right? Good or bad. With that in mind, let's look at Ephesians 5:1-2. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love. And just as Christ loved us and gave himself up as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. As followers of Jesus, we're called to live lives as fragrant sacrifices, transforming the atmosphere around us. Have you ever met some people that can just change the atmosphere of a room? Good or bad? There's some people that walk into a room and you're like, oh, I'm so glad they're here. And there's other people that's like, oh my, they're here. As Graham Cook often says, those are those extra grace required people. But wouldn't it be, I'm an extra grace required husband. Wouldn't it be amazing to live a life where when you walked into the room, everyone was excited and that the atmosphere had changed? I think that's a picture of what God is getting at here. So what does this look like? What does it look like to be a fragrant offering? An offering done correctly is a pleasant aroma to God. However, a sacrifice offered with the wrong attitudes repulses God. So you see in Scripture all the time that God is like, hey, do these sacrifices, and when it's done right, God is like, oh, that's a pleasing aroma to me. But when it's done out of the wrong heart or the wrong spirit, or you're just going through the motions, it does not, it actually repulses God. And Amos, the prophet, minor prophet, says this in the Message. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Quite the indictment, eh? Especially when you think of like Leviticus. Basically, God is saying, you guys can't even do that right. You're missing the intent here. You think that, well, I can just offer these sacrifices. I can still be a jerk. I don't have to change. As long as I offer these sacrifices, everything's okay. And God's like, you know what I would actually prefer is a contrite heart and mercy. And particularly, we need to understand the ancient Near Eastern cultic understanding of sacrifice. Okay? And for this, I'm going to be borrowing a bunch from the Bible Project, which is, I think, an absolutely incredible series. And I'm getting a text from... Must be delayed. The mic is working fine, apparently. Where was I? The Bible Project. Hey, if you actually want an overview of the Bible, this is a great resource. They have all these incredible videos and stuff like that. And basically what it is they have this one guy who is like a brilliant theologian, and then there's another guy who is a cartoonist, and they've got together and figured out a way to take this intelligence and communicate it in a way. So, this is what he says here. Many of us have inherited a story about animal sacrifices. And it goes something like this. The gods are angry with me and are going to kill me. But maybe if I kill this animal and make sure the gods get their pound of flesh, they'll be appeased and happy. Maybe they won't kill me or send me a plague on my family. And we see this perspective a lot in the movies and stuff like that about offering sacrifices. We need to somehow appease them and so on. And particularly burnt offerings. The view of burnt offerings was that you, by burning the offering, you were actually feeding the gods. And so the gods would come and eat, and then because they liked the meal, they would give you favor and stuff like that. So that was what the culture was, an understanding of sacrifices. But see, in Judaism, Yahweh, God, didn't need to be persuaded or appeased. He was committed to being Israel's God, period. He made a covenant. He wasn't leaving. So that attitude towards sacrifices of appeasing and persuading does not apply here. Much of popular Christian belief has simply imported a pagan storyline, reminiscent of the Greek and Babylonian cultural texts referenced above, into Leviticus and the stories about Jesus on the cross. So, and this is one of those areas that I find really frustrating. And for myself, I find it frustrating because I had imported all these kind of ideas of sacrifice onto this biblical view, and particularly of Jesus, and then to realize actually the biblical view is different than that, and I was misinterpreting the sacrifices. So when you import these ideas, this is what the gospel sounds like, okay? God is holy and perfect. You are not. Therefore, God is angry at you or hates you, so he has to kill you. But because he's merciful, he will let you bring this animal to him and will have the animal killed instead of you. Thankfully, Jesus came to be the one who gets killed by God instead of me. Jesus rescues us from God, so now we can go forever to the happy place after we die and not the bad place. Anyone ever heard something similar like that? That is not the gospel. This idea that Jesus needed to step in the way from an angry God. God is love. He doesn't need to be persuaded. See, sin in Leviticus, human sin, is an act that vandalizes, it infects, and it defiles God's good world and vandalizes the world. Sorry, typo there. So instead of sin like needing a blood or a payment or a penalty or a punishment, our sin is defiling. It's like vandalism. When God created the world, he said it was good. And it was good. And then humanity decided to go its own way, and then we made a mess of things. Sin is the result of fractured relationships, and it leads to power struggles, violence, and widespread systematic evil. Just turn on the news, and we still see it, don't we? It's interesting that the very first thing that happened after Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, Adam and Eve started blaming each other. It was her, it was me. And next thing you know, their kids are killing each other. And just that whole cycle. And we live in a world that believes power is through threat of violence. Israel's sin doesn't just defile the camp, it even defiles the sacred space itself. It makes God want to leave, just like vandalism and heaps of trash everywhere would make you want to leave the space. Everyone been to like a beach and then you find junk all over it? Not so fun, is it? Or a park? And this whole idea of the camp, you think about in Israel at the time when they were in the wilderness, this is the tabernacle. And so this is where God's holiness and presence was supposed to be. It was a meeting place between God and humanity, and our sin was defiling it and distorting it, so making it that God didn't want to be there. And the cumulative effect of our sin on the world. The tabernacle and the temple is the meeting place between heaven and earth, the throne of God and human space. So the temple is the meeting place where we would come to meet with God. And Israel's rebellion isn't simply about breaking a rule, it's about humans introducing corruption, pain, and death into God's world. If you look and read Genesis, it reads like building of a temple. And if you look at the descriptions of the temple, you will see a lot of similarities to the Garden of Eden story. And that this is the place where God was going to dwell with his people, and it was going to be good. And then Adam and Eve chose to go a different way, and they distorted that, and Adam and Eve were sent out of the garden. But God didn't want to give up on them, so he said, okay, we'll have the tabernacle, we'll have the temple. This will be the place of connection and meeting and stuff like that. But in order for that place to take place, there had to be a cleaning, a purifying of that. So the sin might as well be bringing the corruption into the dwelling place of God. If Israel's God leaves the temple space, then the entire nation will suffer the consequences of living in a land without God. In Ezekiel, the prophet talks about this. He has this vision that there was so much sin going on. Then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped above the cherubim. That would have been a terrifying prophetic word that God's presence was leaving. Simply that God says, I can no longer be a part of this situation because you are so corrupt. But God's story doesn't end there. God's story is about him coming back. All those passages in Isaiah about making a clear path for the Lord to, or clear road for the Lord to return, this is what it's referring to. God's presence has left, and we're waiting for God to come back. And God comes back in the form of Jesus. So this brings us to God's way of dealing with Israel's sin and rebellion. Because God is committed to his people. He's still going to make a way for us to be connected. So the sacrifices, it's a symbolic ritual that takes an existing practice among Israel's neighbors. So the animal sacrifices, hey, we gotta make a sacrifice to appease or something like that. And it transforms its meaning. So the animal's symbolic death is a physical symbol of what's really at stake. The life or death of the community. You could call this part of as the symbol deterrent. It's saying, hey, you know what the consequences of sin is? Death. You can't live without me. And the way sin left unchecked leads to murder and all those vices. And so by having the sacrifice and animal saying, hey, this is really what the consequences of your sin are. But then since blood represents life, or the opposite of death, its sprinkling around the temple would act like a detergent. It symbolically washed the temple of death and defilement, the natural result of sin. So when the priest would come in and sprinkle that blood and stuff like that, it was like Lysol wipes. In covering the decay of sin with life. And so that God's presence could be there. But here's the problem. It only worked temporarily. It needed to be repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. So God had an answer to this. Hebrews 9:13-15. If that animal's blood and the other rituals of purification were effective in cleaning up certain matters of our religion and behavior, think how much more the blood of Christ cleans up our whole lives inside and out. Through the Spirit, Christ offered himself as an unblemished sacrifice, freeing us from all those dead-end efforts to make ourselves respectable so that we can live all out for God. That Christ's blood, because it was sinless, had an effect that animal sacrifices could not do, a permanent effect, so that we could be with God. So we go back to this Ephesians 5:1-2. Follow God's example, therefore, as a dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So what does that look like when we no longer need sacrifices to purify? What does it look like when blood sacrifices are no longer necessary? Eugene Peterson has this wonderful insight here. The drama of the blood flowing out of a sacrificial animal was impressive in its symbolism, but the animal was worthless from that time on except to be eaten. A short-lived usefulness. This new concept is no less a sacrifice, but the blood stays in the veins and continues to nourish the life of the individual. Thus, the new offering becomes an extended one. So instead of the pouring out of the blood that we carry that has been purified by Christ, that flows through our bodies, our actions are bringing restoration and life and bringing a sweet fragrance to the world. Become a fragrant offering in how you live. The life that God has given you. The life that God's calling you to. And as I said about the training diapers, God is never content with where you're at. He always has more to show to you. And when he shows us more, we're invited to show that to others. Wouldn't it be incredible if neighborhoods got excited when Christians moved in to the neighborhood? It's like, oh, we're so lucky. We have some Christians. They absolutely change the atmosphere. Rather than what is often presented as, oh no, Christians, judgmental, judgy. They're going to be pointing the finger and walking around like they're better than us. That's not a fragrant offering. That's a stink. Instead of blood being sprinkled to counteract the effects of sin and death on the world, our actions as followers of Jesus are to counteract the effects of sin and death in the world. Our lives are to be a fragrant offering to change the atmosphere around us. We are to smell like Jesus. Our lives and actions are to bring healing and restoration. That's what I believe it means to be a fragrant offering. To live lives that change the atmosphere, that bring healing and hope. What an incredible calling that is. That as Christ transforms us, and as we live our lives for him, we begin to smell like Jesus. And transform the world. Amen.